Story 1. I'm a female and I was in my 20s at the time when I moved to Manchester, UK from a small town nearby. I accept friendships with anyone. At first I found it exciting to make new connections so easily and explore such an exciting place with others. However, I learned quickly why some people avoid talking at bus stops. It all started when I was waiting for a bus to work. It was a mild day at around 11 a.m. in the city center. As I waited for the bus, a short, medium-built man, we'll call him Craig, approached the stand. After the bus failed to turn up, he began making small talk that quickly escalated. Once the bus finally arrived, we sat nearby and continued talking. He opened up about a lot of personal things I'm used to talking openly and in depth, so this didn't faze me. As we got off the bus, we exchanged numbers. We didn't message much, just arranged to meet a week later. The day came and the evening was nice at first. I told him about a date I had earlier in the week, and he shared some dating disaster stories. We began laughing. He asked what type of guys I liked. I described them, which was not at all how he looked or his personality. He wasn't flirting at all at that point. I have male friends that I've known for years and have never crossed any boundaries. I grew up with all brothers, so I'm used to being around men and partaking in sports and martial arts. As the night progressed, I was ready to go home, but he suggested that we go to a late bar. As he was happy that he had a new friend and he wanted to show me one of his favorite spots, I was tired, but knowing I could get the late bus home, I agreed to go for an hour or two. We found seats by the door away from the dance floor. There was a setup of tables and chairs that operated as a pub during the day. It was a weeknight, so there were just a few other people around. As the music got louder, it came to the point where listening and talking became hard. I was going to suggest that we call it a night, however. He started opening up again, telling me more personal stories of loss and other events. Suddenly, a tall Irish man approached. At first, we thought he must work there until the man asked me if I wanted to dance. It was weird because I was clearly sitting down in mid-conversation with Craig. The guy didn't seem drunk, just cheeky and intrusive. I politely declined and slowly walked away. Craig didn't say anything, and about 15 minutes later, he went to the bathroom. The stranger then came back again. He asked me why I was with Craig and said that I could do much better. It really annoyed me, so I gave him an angry look and said, "I'm happy, thanks, go enjoy your night." The guy was persistent and didn't go away until Craig returned. He looked down at Craig, looked at me, then laughed before walking away. I'm quite tall for a female and slim, so perhaps it looked like an odd fit to a stranger. We ignored what just happened, and Craig continued pouring his stories out. At this point, he was getting rather drunk. He started sitting closer to me, attempting to flirt and telling me how he would treat me so well if we were dating. I told him I wasn't interested romantically. His demeanor suddenly changed. He moved away and stared at the floor. I began to put my coat on. At that point, he turned to me and asked where I was going. His breath was pungent. I can't explain the odor, but until that point, he hadn't been so close to my face. I could feel the temperature of it. He came that close. I walked outside and ushered him to come out too. I told him that I appreciated how kind he'd been sharing his stories and listening to me, but that romantically I wasn't looking for that with him. I walked across the road. It wasn't the main road, but just next to it, so cars did pull in every few minutes. He walked with me, then suddenly he stopped in the middle of the road, put his hands on his head, stared at the ground, and began repeating, "I don't get it. I don't get it. I don't get it. I don't get it." I approached him and said that I didn't think I'd given any impression and I was sorry if I had. I never flirt with men that I have no interest in, not in the slightest. I don't giggle or smile at them. I simply listen and talk. He began sobbing and said in between tears falling into his mouth that he was confused because he got on with me better than with anyone. I told him it would be easy for him to connect if he's open with others the way he had been with me. He got close to me again, put his hands on my arms and went close to my face, saying how I should give him a chance. He crossed the boundary physically, and mentally I was angry now. I didn't expect to take care of a grown man or have him try to manipulate me to go on a date. I pulled myself away from him and said I'd take him to his bus stop. I really didn't want him to know where I lived yet. His face suddenly lit up, and he was adamant that he would take me to my bus stop. I kept attempting to get him away to the point where I checked the bus times online and lied that his was due and mine was 20 minutes away. That backfired, so I reluctantly had him walk with me. Thankfully, my bus came quickly, and I lied about where I lived. The bus went all the way to the airport, so he would never know. He tried calling me about 10 times that night. The next day, he left voicemails and messages. They were all pleading for me to date him. It was excessive and intense, so I blocked his number. For the following 3 months, he would call me from many different numbers, mobile and landlines. I Googled one of them, and it was his work. He was a head chef at a fancy restaurant. After 5 months had passed, I felt at ease. That was until I began working at promoting a nightclub. I had only been there a few weeks when I went to sign in, and a guy held the door open for me. As I said thanks, I realized that it was him. I was in shock and shaking, so I went outside. I rushed to tell my colleague. She said, "Oh, him? Yeah, he's a promoter too." I told her what happened between us, and she said, "Craig, that doesn't sound like him." I quickly lied and said, No, I thought it was a different guy." We laughed, but inside I was terrified. Why would a head chef be working a minimum wage job standing outside in the freezing cold handing out flyers? As I went to sign out, I was scared because my full name was on the sheet, and I was worried that he would search for me somehow. I noted down his full name just in case I needed it. I never returned to that job, and I didn't hear from him. I wasn't sure if he recognized me, but I wasn't taking any chances. I changed my name on Facebook and only had one colleague from there. Craig was not on his friends list. However, he still found me and added me. 2 weeks later, needless to say, I blocked him and deactivated my account. I never post where I work. Fast forward to another 5 years later, it had been nearly a year since I began working as a host at a cocktail bar. The bar was tucked away in a quieter side of Manchester. When I looked at the interview sheet, I saw his name. The job he was on the list for was in the kitchen, although certainly not head chef wage, so I was shocked, but also thought it could be coincidental. The interviews came across 3 days. I signed people in and out. I was there to greet them all. He never showed up, and someone else was hired. Thankfully, it's been nearly 10 years now, and fortunately, I've not heard from him since. I've had experiences with other stalkers and learned the hard way to be careful with who I make friends with, whether through work or small talk at a bus stop. Stalkers are all around us. Story 2. I was in college when this happened, and it was my second year. I was still living with my parents back then, but hardly spent any time at home. My best friend Heather Nair lived near the school in a shared apartment. We would hang out at her place a lot. I would even spend the night there a few times a week. Usually she and I had a lot of classes together early in the week, so we were basically inseparable at that time. It was a Tuesday afternoon. We were in between classes, just hanging out around the library. There were some outdoor picnic tables there, and we were just sitting around talking. We had a class coming up in about half an hour, so we weren't doing much. Then a man approached us. He looked much older than most students, maybe in his 30s. His clothes were shabby and his hair was greasy. He didn't look like a student at all, and I'm sure Heather noticed it too. He began flirting with Heather, but in a really sarcastic way. Not sure what kind of charm he was going for, but it really wasn't working. Heather tried to brush him off politely at first, but he was persistent. I could tell she was getting uncomfortable. That's when I stepped in and told him to back off. He looked at me for a second, then just laughed and walked away. Heather and I were both a bit shaken up, but we didn't think much of it after that. The next day we were back at Heather's apartment, just hanging out like usual. We were in her room watching TV and chatting when we heard a knock on the door. Heather went to answer it, and guess who was standing there? It was the guy from yesterday. He was holding a bouquet of flowers and had this creepy smile on his face. Heather was completely taken aback. She didn't know what to say. He just walked right into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. I was sitting on the bed, trying to process what was happening. He walked over to Heather and handed her the flowers, saying something like, "I thought you might like these." Heather didn't say anything. She just took the flowers and stood there, looking really uncomfortable. I could tell she was trying to figure out what to do. Then the guy turned to me and said, "So, are you Heather's roommate?" I just nodded, not knowing what else to say. He looked at me for a second, then turned back to Heather. He stayed for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, chatting with Heather like they were old friends. It was really weird. He was acting like nothing was wrong. Eventually, he said he had to go and walked out the door. Heather and I just stood there staring at each other. We couldn't believe what had just happened. After he left, Heather called campus security and told them what had happened. They said they would keep an eye out for him and told us to call if he came back. Thankfully, we never saw him again after that day. But it was definitely a scary experience, and it made us both more cautious about who we talked to on campus. Story 3. I used to work the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store in a relatively quiet part of town. The store wasn't very busy during the night, and I often worked alone, which I didn't mind. It gave me time to read or catch up on schoolwork. However, there was one night that still haunts me. It was a typical Tuesday night, around 2 a.m., and I hadn't seen a customer in over an hour. I was stocking some shelves when I heard the bell above the door chime. I looked up and saw a man walk in. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and wearing a dirty, tattered jacket. Something about him immediately put me on edge. His eyes were wide and darting around the store erratically. I greeted him as usual. "Good evening, can I help you find anything?" He didn't respond and just continued to pace up and down the aisles, occasionally glancing over at me. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and went back to stocking shelves, but I kept a discreet eye on him. After about 10 minutes, the man approached the counter with a single bottle of water. I rang him up, trying to be as friendly as possible, but he just stared at me, not saying a word. When I gave him his change, he grabbed my hand and held it for a moment longer than necessary, then released it and walked out of the store without another word. I thought that was the end of it, but about 30 minutes later I heard the bell chime again. I looked up and there he was, standing in the doorway, just staring at me. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there staring. My heart started pounding in my chest. I forced a smile and said, "Can I help you with something?" But he didn't respond. After what felt like an eternity, he finally walked into the store and started pacing the aisles again. This time he didn't pick up anything. He just kept walking around, occasionally glancing at me with those wild eyes. I decided it was time to call my manager. I went to the back room, grabbed the phone, and dialed his number. As I was waiting for him to pick up, I heard the door chime again. I peeked out and saw the man leaving the store, but this time he stood just outside the door, staring in at me. My manager finally answered, and I quickly explained the situation. He told me to lock the doors and call the police if the man came back. I hung up and locked the front door, feeling a bit more secure but still on edge. I spent the rest of my shift constantly checking the security cameras and peeking out the windows, but the man didn't come back. A few nights later I was working again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard a noise outside. I looked out the window and saw the same man standing across the street, staring at the store. I quickly locked the doors and called the police. They arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. The police took my statement and promised to keep an eye on the area. For the next few weeks, I noticed a patrol car driving by the store every night. The man never returned, but the fear he instilled in me lingered for a long time. I eventually switched to a day shift position, unable to shake the feeling of vulnerability that came with working alone at night. To this day, I still wonder what that man's intentions were and if he ever found another victim to torment. Working the night shift can be peaceful and quiet, but it also brings out the creepiest people, reminding you how vulnerable you can be in the dark, quiet hours of the night. Story 4. I began subletting a rental house cabin for a couple of months in 2023 when my dad and I were bucking heads and I needed to move out. The actual renter of the apartment was having his own personal issues causing him to leave the apartment, and I'll just refer to him as my landlord to make it easier. The cabin was an entire unit rental and it was paid month to month, which was ideal for my temporarily shitty situation. It was 2 floors technically, a small kitchen, decent-sized living space, and 1 bedroom that you had to climb a little flight of stairs to get to, and there was a quirky hatch-type door that you'd have to open to get to the upstairs bedroom. I had already been there for a month and paid for the second month's rent already by this point, so I was fully situated there. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road with a few other similarly sized cabin-type houses. One was vacant as far as I knew because I never saw cars parked out front or lights on. The other houses, well, I never met the neighbors, but I knew people lived in them. I work 12-hour shifts sometimes, and when I get home, I'm completely exhausted and will just go straight to bed and watch TV until I fall asleep. This was one of those nights. I got home, made a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a protein shake as my late-night dinner, then went to bed. I always shut the door and the floor every night. I find myself to be uncomfortable at night having the entrance to your bedroom open. Something about it makes me feel exposed or vulnerable. Though this door and the floor didn't have a lock, this cabin was made for one person or a couple. I was watching TV in bed when I heard it. A voice from down below saying, "Who's up there?" I instantly felt my heart stop for a second as I shot up to an upright position. It sounded like it came from inside the house, but it also could have maybe come from outside. I grabbed the TV remote to turn off the TV. I crawled over to look at the circular window above the bed. I didn't see anyone out there, but it was also very dark. I said, "Who's there?" And the deafening silence that followed afterwards led me to getting off the bed and putting my hand on the handle to the door. I lifted the door and looked down the staircase. I actually said my dad's name, Trey. Thinking maybe he came over, there was no response. I walked downstairs. I was extremely scared. I flicked on the first light switch I passed. The living room lit up as I expected. In the back of my head, there wasn't anyone down there. I was still chalking this up to someone from outside. I turned on the front outside light and looked out the windows, and there wasn't anyone in front. By this point, I was really confused. I turned off the living room light and climbed the stairs back to my bedroom, shutting the door and the floor. I was pretty awake now, so I turned the TV back on, and not even 5 minutes later, I heard pounds on the bedroom door from below. They sounded angry or like they were supposed to scare me. If there was any doubt before, this confirmed that someone was in the house. I left the TV on this time and just stayed completely motionless because I was genuinely too scared to move an inch. The scariest part was whoever was down there could easily open the door as there was no lock. I laid silent for about 20 minutes, and once I felt comfortable to move, I looked for my phone. And of course, of all times, it wasn't on my nightstand. I couldn't find it. I may have left it downstairs. So I opened the door of my bedroom and looked down the stairs. With the constantly changing light from the TV screen, I could see just a little bit down the stairs to the living room. So I went down the stairs quietly, and when at the bottom, instead of turning on any lights, I ran out the back door barefoot and ran to the nearest neighbor's house where I knew people lived, and I saw their lights were on. I knocked on the door a bunch of times, and then I noticed someone at the window next to the door looking at me. I didn't know how long they had been watching me. I yelled through the glass, explaining what happened, that I'm his neighbor and that I need a phone to call the police. He definitely heard me, but he just stared at me. It was unsettling, and I started to back away from the door as I realized he wasn't even responding to me, just creepily watching me. I looked around the road and saw no other houses in the distance with their lights on. Momentarily, I had a thought, what if that guy had something to do with it? I went back to my rental through the back door, which was closed just like I left it. I went inside and locked it and turned on every light in the tiny house. I looked not only for an intruder but my phone downstairs, and I finally found my phone in my car when I thought to look there. I was so tired earlier that I left it in the center console. I went back inside. The TV was still on up in the bedroom. I climbed the stairs, and when I got to the top, I saw someone sitting on my bed staring at the TV. It was a man. I screamed, and he turned his head slowly to look at me, and before I could see anything else, I ran back down the stairs and outside, and now with my phone called 911. I sat in my locked car, watching the house on the line with 911, and I saw someone walking past the backyard of the house, disappearing into the woods. I told the operator this. When a police car arrived, the one officer checked the house and upstairs room after I told him that I saw someone, most likely the intruder, walk away into the woods. He asked if I had any other places to stay that night, so I swallowed my pride and went back to my dad's house for the night after packing some of my important stuff. I returned to the house the next day and stayed another night, then collected the rest of my stuff. Luckily, the landlord agreed to give me some of my money back. He asked me what the man looked like, and after that he didn't ask any more questions, which to me is pretty sis. Something was unusual in that situation, from that creepy neighbor ignoring me to the landlord's random urgent need to move out to someone full on breaking into the house. Maybe it's all connected, or maybe I'm overthinking it. Story 5. It was a Tuesday night around 11 p.m. in 2013, and I was walking down a dimly lit street at night on my way home from work. My car had been in the shop, so I'd been forced to walk 3 miles home every day. The walk was barely an hour, so I was home before midnight. I live in a small town in southern Indiana, so after 10 there's rarely any cars on the road. The only vehicles you ever see are truckers heading to Indianapolis. I was about a mile into the walk when I turned on a dirt road. My house was off the beaten path, so I had to take all these dirt roads surrounded by forest to get there. As I was turning, I heard the sound of a motor in the distance, and it was getting closer very slowly. I saw about a quarter mile down the stretch of road I just turned off of a van moving very slowly without its lights. At first, this didn't strike me as out of place due to the fact that the town I live in has a pretty cheap car dealership that sells used cars and vans with broken parts like broken headlights, so I just assumed this guy was one of their clients. I kept walking down the side road with the van still going slowly down the main road. About 5 seconds later, I jumped when I heard the sound of the van roar, and it sped up really fast, except now it had its lights on. I was startled but not worried. This was until the van got closer to the turn for the side road. About 500 feet away from the turn, the van turned off its lights again and slowed down. Now I was officially creeped out. I didn't want to seem startled, so I just walked faster down the road. I kept turning back constantly to see if I was being followed. Then my suspicions became reality as I saw the van turn onto the dirt road. I was only about 500 feet from the van, so I started to walk a lot faster. I didn't want to look back, but I did just to be safe, and what I saw frightened every bone in my body. I saw the van there, stopped with both the passenger and driver's doors open. At this point, I ran for my life down the dirt road. I heard what I'm positive was a gunshot not far away, and I really thought this was how I was going to die. I made a quick turn into one of the surrounding forests and hid behind a big rock. I heard what sounded like a middle-aged man not far away say, "I think she went into the woods," and then to my horror, what sounded like 3 young girls with one of them responding, "Okay, sir, I'll see if we can find her." Now, I wasn't fearing for my life. I was worrying I was going to be forced into whatever sick group this was. I was covering my mouth, trying not to make any sound when I heard the man say, "Whoever finds her doesn't have to drink the blood tonight." A million thoughts ran through my head, but I put that out of my mind and just focused on trying to stay hidden. I heard footsteps get closer and closer. They were within 5 feet of me, but they must have missed me, as after 5 minutes of hiding there silently, I heard the man shout, "All right, get back to the van. We need to get to Indianapolis by morning." They all walked back. I heard the doors slam shut and the van turn on and drive away. I stayed hiding for another 20 minutes before I deemed it safe to leave. I sprinted through the woods to my house, eventually getting there in one piece. I told my parents what had happened, and they called the police. They never found anyone in the van, and even to this day I have no idea who they were or what they were doing, but one thing's for sure, I'm never walking home from work again. Story 6. This story took place over the course of 2014 and still freaks me out to this day. My girlfriend and I, who I will call Tara for this story, moved into our dream house in the summer of 2014. We were both 24 at the time, and we bought the house as soon as we saw it. It was a small house at the end of a quiet road in a small town in the south. There were only 2 other houses on the street, and they were both on the other side of the road. The house had a nice yard and a big field behind it that Tara loved. She was always one for the outdoors, so when we first moved in, she spent all of her time in that field. I worked as a freelance photographer, so I was always away from home for long periods. Tara didn't have a job and spent most of her time at home. I didn't mind. I made enough money to support us both, and I wanted her to be happy. Everything was great for the first few months. Tara and I were both in love with our new home, and we were happier than ever. But then things started to get weird. It all started one night in September when I was working late in my office. Tara was asleep in our bedroom, and I was editing some photos on my computer when I heard a noise outside. It sounded like someone was walking around in the yard. I got up and went to the window to see if I could see anything, but it was too dark. I couldn't see anything, but I could still hear the noise. It was getting closer. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the door to see if I could see anything. I opened the door and shined the flashlight around the yard, but there was nothing there. The noise had stopped and everything was quiet again. I shrugged it off and went back to my office to finish my work. But then it happened again the next night and the night after that. Every night I would hear the noise, and every night I would go to the door with my flashlight, but I could never see anything. It was starting to freak me out, but Tara didn't seem to notice. She was always asleep when it happened, and I didn't want to wake her up and worry her. But then one night I woke up to the sound of Tara screaming. I jumped out of bed and ran to her. She was standing in the middle of the bedroom pointing at the window. "There's someone out there," she screamed. I ran to the window and looked out, but I didn't see anything. Tara was hysterical, so I calmed her down and told her it was probably just an animal. But she didn't believe me. She said she saw a man standing in the yard watching her. I didn't know what to do, so I called the police. They came and looked around the yard, but they didn't find anything. They told us it was probably just an animal and not to worry about it. But Tara was still freaked out. She didn't want to sleep in the bedroom anymore, so we started sleeping in the living room. A few nights later, I was woken up by the sound of the front door opening. I jumped up and ran to the door, but there was no one there. The door was wide open, but there was no sign of anyone. I was starting to get really freaked out, but Tara didn't want to leave. She loved the house too much. She said it was just our imagination and that we were overreacting. But then one night I came home from a long day at work to find Tara sitting on the couch crying. She said she saw the man again. He was standing in the yard watching her. I didn't know what to do. We couldn't afford to move, and Tara didn't want to leave. So we decided to install some security cameras around the house. The cameras caught nothing for the first few weeks. But then one night I was woken up by the sound of the front door opening again. I ran to the door, but there was no one there. I checked the security footage, but there was nothing. The cameras didn't show anything. I was starting to think we were going crazy. But then one night I was woken up by the sound of the back door opening. I ran to the door and saw a man standing in the yard. He was just standing there staring at the house. I called the police, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. The cameras didn't show anything again. Tara was scared to leave the house, and I didn't know what to do. I was starting to think we were being haunted. But then one night I was woken up by the sound of someone talking. I got up and went to the living room to see if Tara was awake, but she was sound asleep on the couch. The talking was coming from outside. I went to the window and looked out, but I couldn't see anything. The talking was getting louder, and it sounded like it was coming from the field behind the house. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to see if I could see anything. I walked to the field and shined the flashlight around, but there was nothing there. The talking had stopped, and everything was quiet again. I was about to turn around and go back to the house when I heard a noise behind me. I turned around and saw a man standing there. He was just standing there staring at me. I was frozen with fear. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. The man just stood there for a few seconds, and then he turned and walked away. I ran back to the house and called the police. They came and looked around, but they didn't find anything. Tara and I decided to leave the house after that. We couldn't take it anymore. We moved out a few days later, and we never looked back. I don't know who the man was or what he wanted, but I'm just glad we got out of there. The house is still there, and I still think about it sometimes. I wonder if anyone else has had the same experience as we did. I hope not. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Story 7. My boyfriend and I moved into our first apartment together at the beginning of the month. We're pretty young. I'm 18 and he's 20, so renting an apartment is a huge deal for us. We didn't have much money starting off, so we were ecstatic when we found a cheap place with such nice-looking photos online. It was on the outskirts of the city in a rougher area, but it didn't matter to us because it was so close to my boyfriend's work. When we first moved in, everything was perfect. The apartment was tiny and furnished with bare essentials, but we didn't care. It was our place. The first week passed without a hitch, and we felt like everything was going great. That was until we noticed something strange. One night we were lying in bed when we heard the distinct sound of a door creaking open from somewhere in the apartment. We got up to investigate, but we couldn't find anything. All the doors were closed, and there was no sign of anyone else in the apartment. We shrugged it off. thinking it might just be the building settling or something. The next night, the same thing happened. We heard the door creaking open again, and this time it was followed by a soft whispering sound. We were both freaked out, but again, when we investigated, we found nothing. It kept happening night after night. The door would creak open and we'd hear the whispering, but we could never find the source. We started getting paranoid, thinking that someone might be breaking into our apartment. But there were no signs of forced entry and nothing was ever missing. One night, my boyfriend had to work late, so I was home alone. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard the door creaking open again. This time it was followed by the sound of footsteps. I was terrified. I grabbed my phone and called my boyfriend, telling him what was happening. He told me to lock the bedroom door and wait for him to get home. I did as he said, and I could hear the footsteps getting closer and closer. I was shaking with fear, thinking that someone was going to break into the bedroom any second. When my boyfriend finally got home, he found me huddled in the corner of the bedroom, crying. He checked the entire apartment, but again there was no sign of anyone. We decided to call the police, but they didn't find anything either. They told us it was probably just the building settling and that we shouldn't worry about it. But we knew something was wrong. We couldn't explain it, but we knew that something was happening in that apartment. The next night, we decided to stay up and see if we could catch whatever was causing the strange occurrences. We sat in the living room with all the lights on, nervously waiting. Around 2 a.m., we heard the familiar sound of the door creaking open. This time, we were ready. My boyfriend quietly grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, and we both tiptoed towards the hallway where the sound had come from. As we approached, we saw the doorknob slowly turning. My heart was pounding in my chest as my boyfriend raised the bat, ready to strike. Suddenly, the door swung open, and there was a loud crash as something fell to the ground. We both screamed, but quickly realized what had happened. It wasn't a ghost or an intruder, it was our cat, Ninja. Our mischievous cat had learned how to open the bedroom door by jumping on the handle and pushing it down. The whispering sounds we heard were just Ninja's playful meows and purrs. The footsteps were his paws padding around the apartment. Relieved and slightly embarrassed, we couldn't help but laugh at ourselves. It turned out that our haunting experience was just a case of an adventurous cat causing nighttime mischief. We made sure to keep the bedroom door securely closed from then on, and Ninja never managed to surprise us like that again. It was a lesson in not jumping to conclusions and remembering that sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. We were able to enjoy the rest of our time in that apartment without any further scares, and Ninja continued to bring laughter and joy into our lives with his antics. Story 8. I used to go bowling quite often with my friends when I was young. I'm talking like 12, 13. There was a bowling alley down the block from my friends and I, so we'd go there on weekends. The bowling alley has been closed for years, but when it was open it was super cheap and affordable, perfect for a bunch of young teenagers who didn't have money of their own. This one weekend I went with my friends Jacob, Josh, and Mikey to the bowling alley. We always went at night, likely around 8 p.m. The bowling alley was always crowded on the weekends, and sometimes we'd see familiar faces. There was this older man who would sometimes be there alone bowling on the adult side of the bowling alley where alcohol was served. We always played on the non-alcoholic side. We took notice of that man because he'd sometimes weirdly walk down the entire bowling alley, passing every lane, watching people bowl. Then we'd notice him end up back at his lane all by himself. We nicknamed him Creeper Bob after maybe the third time seeing him. Tonight there was a lane open next to us, and guess who out of nowhere sat next to us? Bob, or whatever his real name was, but I'll keep referring to him as Bob. He was setting up a game on the lane next to us by himself, and it wasn't long until he started trying to talk to us. He started making comments on our form and every so often interrupting our conversation to tell us weird things like how long he's been coming here. Then eventually he said something really weird, that he watches us play every weekend from across the bowling alley, and he decided to come over and introduce himself tonight. He played it off like he was trying to be some kind of bowling teacher to us, but really it was just annoying and most of all uncomfortable. Bob at one point entered our lane as I was up to bowl, and he grabbed my wrist with his hands to position me into allegedly better form. I never gave him permission to touch me, nor did I ask for his guidance. We were only like 13 though, None of us stood up and said, "Y'all get lost," or something like that. I could just feel the unease amongst my friends every moment of that man touching me. I felt more and more disgusted. We cut our night at the bowling alley short because of him. We used the money that we would have used on more games on getting pizza instead at a pizza place further down the block. When we came out, Jacob and Mikey went their own way since they lived on a different block. Josh and I walked back in the direction of our houses. As we did, the sound of a car engine starting made us turn around. We noticed an old SUV, like a Ford Explorer, doing a three-point turn. We both imagined the possibility of it being Creeper Bob. The SUV started slowly tailing us as we walked down the street, so we picked up our pace. Then the SUV pulled up right alongside us and the window rolled down. It was in fact the man from the bowling alley. He said out the window that he could offer us a ride home. We said, "No thanks," he replied. "It's not safe for a couple kids to be walking around late at night." We weren't even really that young. We were young teenagers, not little kids, and it was crazy that he thought we were young enough to trick into getting into a car. When we made it clear we weren't getting in, he pulled to the side of the road and parked his car. Josh and I decided to start jogging home. When we reached the intersection where we'd split off, we said bye and I continued jogging home. By the time I made it back, I was out of breath. Running after eating pizza is not a good idea. My dad was already asleep because he worked weekends. My mom was out with her girlfriends most likely, and the same was probably the case with my sister. So I wasn't supposed to ring the bell because my dad didn't want to be woken up. I went around back to get the key we had for the back door, which was hidden in the shed. When I got out from the shed, I thought I heard something, and I should have listened to my gut. I went to the back door to unlock it, and as I opened the door, I heard the sound of someone running up behind me. Before I could fully turn around, someone pushed me inside the house, covering my mouth and wrapping their arm around my neck. I wasn't able to see who it was because I couldn't turn my head. I scratched and clawed at the man's hand until I could move my mouth just enough out of the grip of his hand and scream, "Dad." I may have only been 13, but I was able to put up enough of a fight to get him to lose his grip a few times, allowing me to scream. This undoubtedly scared him off as he finally let go for good and ran outside. I didn't look back. I ran up the half flight of stairs to the main floor and yelled for my dad. My dad came rushing out of his room, and after telling him what just happened, he checked the backyard and all around the property, and then came back inside. I told him about the man from the bowling alley, how we nicknamed him Creeper Bob, how he followed Josh and I in his FE after admitting to stalking us at the bowling alley. My dad filed a police report and tried getting the bowling alley to release the video surveillance from that night, but they refused. I was never allowed to go back there after my mom found out about this, not that I'd ever want to. The crazy thing is, technically I can't say with 100% certainty that the man who came in behind me and grabbed me was the man from the bowling alley, but realistically, how slim are the chances that it wasn't him? Story 9. When I was a teenager, my close group of friends were, I guess what you'd call delinquents. We liked causing trouble, breaking rules, and messing around in places we didn't belong. I grew up in a suburb in northern New Jersey, so I guess you could say we were just spoiled kids with nothing better to do. Looking back, the way we passed the time was a little silly, but there's nothing I can do about that now. One of the things we really liked to do was to go exploring in the late hours of the night. Usually we explored abandoned buildings, but not always. We actually got banned from our middle school after jumping through an open window, but that's a story for another time. This particular night, we were planning on executing a riskier task. There were 5 of us, me, Chip, Jason, Rowan, and Anish. Rowan had a tendency to bounce around from job to job, which was kind of a running joke in our squad. He'd quit jobs as quickly as he'd get them, usually for the dumbest reasons you could imagine. He had just picked up a gig as an attendant at a bowling alley a few towns over from us. I'm sure you could see where this is going. He had been entrusted with the key to close up the place the night before. Anish was a master of persuasion, and he somehow convinced Rowan to let us explore the bowling alley at like 3 a.m. I'm telling you, Anish could convince someone to give them their kidney. That's how persistent he was. I haven't heard from him in a while. I think he might actually be in jail right now. Anyway, the 5 of us agreed to get a little drunk before going. We all had a substantial amount to drink except for Jason, who refused to go anywhere unless he was the one driving. His dad had a really nice BMW, and Jason liked being able to end our links when he got tired. After getting a little buzzed, Jason drove the 5 of us to the location. I was the heavy drinker of the squad. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's just who I was at that point in my life. Because of this, I usually took things a little less seriously than I should have, especially when it came to dangerous or risky situations. Rowan unlocked the door and the 5 of us made our way inside. Chip was usually the most cautious, and he kept trying to get us to be careful in his hilariously high-pitched voice. Rowan told us we couldn't actually do any bowling right now, which we were all a little upset about. I had the genius idea of doing some makeshift sliding on the lanes as if they were slip-in slides. Since we were drunk, this was actually pretty fun. The 5 of us soon tired ourselves out and decided we wanted to do some exploring. We asked Rowan if there were any back rooms we could check out, and he told us there were. We made our way into the employee-only area, and Rowan led us to some kind of storage room. We started poking around and flipping things over, just being stupid and careless. We figured Rowan was going to get fired anyway, so we weren't too concerned with messing things up. As we started getting bored, we heard a deafening bump from below us. The 5 of us froze, staring at each other. Jason, the only sober one in the group, asked if the place had a basement. Rowan looked just as shocked as we were and told us that he had no prior knowledge of a potential basement. Anish grinned, eager to continue exploring. Story 10. My college years were some of the best years of my life, don't get me wrong. I'm very happy with the life I live, but my memories of those 4 years are eternal. My advice to anyone still in college, don't take it for granted because it definitely flies by. I went to a beach college. Our campus was literally right on the water. This story takes place while I was undergoing pledge with my pledge class. If you don't know, that's basically a full semester of initiation for everyone who got bids to the frat that semester. Most of what happens during pledge is better left undiscussed. Anyway, it was the last week of pledge before we officially became brothers. Typically, this is the week where the fraternity kicks things up a notch, so to speak. For us, it was commonly understood that at some point during the final week we'd have to undergo the beach challenge. Here's what would happen. The brothers would drive our entire class about 12 miles down the coast on Friday night. Then we'd have an hour to finish a massive keg filled with God knows what. After that, they'd walk us down to the beach, tie all of our wrists together, blindfold us, take our phones, watches, and shoes, and leave us there. We'd have until sunrise to make it back to the house, otherwise we'd all be dropped. To be completely honest with you, I was pretty nervous leading up to this, but there was really nothing I could do. There was nothing any of us could do. I remember it being oddly chilly the night of, but the excitement of becoming a brother and finally being done with all this nonsense was adrenalizing. The kegs were the easy part. By this point, we were pretty comfortable with divvying up the alcohol and pulling trig if necessary. There were 15 of us. After tying us together, the brothers blindfolded everyone but Chandler, who was at the very front of the line. He was to be our eyes, but that's all the help we'd get. Our pledge master was this big Mexican guy named Ramirez, but he insisted we all call him Los Polos, like the restaurant from Breaking Bad. He was a strange dude. He outlined the rules for us one last time, then joined the rest of the brothers and left. We were now on our own. I won't run you through everyone's names, but my closest friends in my pledge class were Chandler, Whitworth, Jackson, and Vikram. I was at the very back of the line, and Whitworth was directly in front of me. We began walking with Chandler leading us. It was hell without our phones. There really was no way of telling how much ground we were covering or how much time we had left. All we could do was keep walking. At first we tried to liven the mood by talking and cracking jokes, but eventually that got old. After what I'll call 2 hours of walking, we were trudging along in complete silence with the occasional stop for someone to throw up. I started to dissociate. Even the sounds of the ocean grew silent as I walked along, trapped inside my own head. It was completely silent. Suddenly I felt a sharp tug on the rope around my wrist, so I took a few big steps forward and stopped, assuming Whitworth had fallen. Whitworth was a little more clumsy than most, so this kind of thing wasn't super surprising. I didn't really have the strength nor energy to ask him if he was all right, so I just waited. I must have been standing there like a statue for a full minute. Something felt off. I was just about to say something when the rope around my wrist was pulled tight again. I resumed walking, pleased that Whitworth hadn't passed out. The trek resumed and I drifted back into my zoned-out phase, feeling terrible. I prayed we were closing in on the final stretch. We had to be. Just then, I took what must have been my 10,000th step, but something was different. Instead of hitting damp sand, my foot slapped the unmistakable thin layer of ocean water. I took a few more steps and the water got deeper, reaching up to my ankles. I was confused. Why would Chandler be leading us into the water? The rope pulled tight again, meaning Whitworth and everyone else in front of me was continuing to walk, so I did the same. I guess I figured someone needed to wash off their feet for whatever reason. If no one else was complaining, though, I definitely wasn't going to start. The water remained ankle height for a while, advancing and receding with the sway of the waves. Just then, though, I felt the water begin to rise again until it was comfortably around my shins. Chandler was definitely screwing with us, which for the life of me I couldn't understand. Why wasn't this stupid activity painful enough? The water was only going to slow us down. Seconds later, I began to pick up on a faint sound in the distance. I craned my ears and began to recognize it. It was the sound of an idling boat engine. As we continued to walk, the drone of the engine only got louder, meaning it was getting closer or I was getting closer to it. I was starting to get really uncomfortable. The water was almost up to my knees at this point. Finally, I broke what must have been hours of unspoken silence. "Guys, what the hell are we doing in the water?" I waited, confused as to why no one was answering me. "Guys," I asked again in a more concerned voice. Still nothing. I could feel panic begin to set in. Suddenly, my blindness was suffocating. I had to look around. I reached my wrists up towards my eyes in an attempt to undo my blindfold. As I did so, the rope yanked away from me, forcing my arms back down. I cursed, plunging my head down towards my fingers and undoing my blindfold before the rope could be jolted away from me again. To my horror, Whitworth wasn't the one guiding me. Instead, I found myself staring at a random middle-aged man holding the frayed end of the rope tied around my wrists. I stared in shock at the severed rope in his hand, and that's when I realized what had done the cutting. A long, rusty kitchen knife sat in his left hand. Past him there was a boat bobbing in the water, and I could make out 3 more silhouettes towering on board. I screamed bloody murder before he had a chance to react, yanking my arms upward as fiercely as I could. At the same time, I lifted a foot out of the water and kicked his chest with all the strength I could muster. Luckily, the rope broke free from his grip. He grabbed my shirt to try and cushion his fall, but the fabric gave way with a deafening rip. He yelled as he plunged into the water with a huge chunk of my white pledge t-shirt, but I was already moving as fast as I could toward dry land, my wrists still tied. A few seconds passed before I heard a splash from further away. Someone had jumped off the boat. I didn't even look behind me, I just kept moving. I was about halfway to the sand when something whizzed right past my head, maybe a few inches from my right ear. It was the knife. I watched it shoot past me before disappearing into the water. I was in complete shock, but the adrenaline was doing its job. I got to land and, for the first time, looked back. There were 2 men in the water and 2 on the boat. They weren't chasing me anymore, just staring lifelessly in my direction. The closest man was still holding onto the white piece of my torn shirt. I didn't waste another second. I ran up the beach and made it to the street. By this point it was past sunrise, but my frat was the last thing I was thinking about. I flagged down the nearest car and, after pleading to use their phone, called the police. It was no use. By the time the cops showed up, the 4 men were gone, presumably off to wherever in that tiny little boat of theirs. I lied to the cops about what happened, worried that there might be repercussions for the frat. Luckily, they didn't ask questions. I didn't get too much crap from my frat brothers. They were actually more pissed at Chandler for not realizing what had happened, even though he swears he didn't hear a thing. After that, I became a brother and things went back to normal. Well, normal for a while. A few weeks later, a couple of the guys and I were playing beach die in the sand behind the house when Jackson noticed something in the distance. There was a stick poking out of the sand, and tied to that stick was the white piece of cloth that had been torn from my t-shirt. The design on the ripped stick was unmistakable. It was my shirt. To this day, I have no idea how they knew which frat I was in. My brothers think they might have recognized the piece of my t-shirt, but I have a more sinister theory. I think it's very possible that they knew our frat would be sending us pledges on that beach that night, helpless and blind. I think they very well could have planned the whole thing around that stupid tradition, swooping in and kidnapping whoever they could. I was just unlucky enough to be in the back, which still gives me chills to this day. I still wonder what might have happened to me had I gotten on that boat. Story 11. So a few months ago, I was out shopping at the mall. I had just left Macy's and was heading towards the parking lot when I noticed a guy sitting on the curb by the entrance. He looked pretty young, maybe in his early 20s, and he seemed upset. I thought about just walking past him, but something about him made me stop. I asked him if he was okay, and he told me he had lost his job and couldn't find his car. He seemed really lost and confused, so I offered to help him look for his car. We walked around the parking lot for a while, trying to find his car. He kept thanking me over and over again for helping him, which seemed a bit excessive, but I just assumed he was really grateful. After about 20 minutes of searching, we finally found his car. He was so relieved and thanked me again before getting in and driving away. I went back to my car feeling pretty good about myself for helping him out, but as I was driving home, something about the whole situation started to bother me. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but then it hit me the guy never actually told me where he parked. I had just assumed he lost his car near Macy's, but he never confirmed that. And he didn't seem to know which car was his until we randomly stumbled upon it. I started to feel really uneasy about the whole thing. What if he had been lying to me? What if he had some ulterior motive for approaching me in the first place? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, trying to figure out if I had missed any red flags. Luckily, nothing bad happened, but it definitely made me more cautious about helping strangers in the future.